Good day and welcome back to the shed. Today we go back to 1955 to take a look at the Hugo Award winning novel for that year that just about broke the Hugo Awards. So what I would like to do is break this down, try to find out exactly why this novel was so controversial when it came out, and it leads many to say that this was the worst of the Hugo Award winning novels. Well, I'd like to provide a spoiler-free plot overview. I'll talk to what I liked and what I didn't like. I'll make some recommendations on similar novels that we've covered today on the shed. I'll put this one to the memory test and we will rank it on our ever-growing sci-fi share ladder, where I have been reading and ranking all the Hugo Award winning novels. And do I agree or disagree that this is the worst of the Hugo Award winning novels? Well, let's get stuck into it. So the novel that I have here in the Forever Machine actually covers the short story Crazy Joey, as well as the full-size novel They'd Rather Be Right, in this limited edition, I think it was, in the Forever Machine. So we learned that there's this little boy called Joey, and he's already at odds with his father, because it appears that Joey's got extrasensory perception. He can read his parents' minds, and he thinks this is normal, and it's putting him in some pretty difficult positions with his parents, because that's sort of fear him in many ways. So he goes through childhood really struggling with this ESP that he has and the ability to read people's minds that is throwing him into all sorts of chaos. And as the novel goes into They'd Rather Be Right, we learn that Joe works for a university. I think he's a research student, or he's a student at the university. And the university has just been commissioned by the army to build this super intelligent computer that will help with the guided missile programs. But Joey gets wind of this and soon realizes that there's a lot of potential in this machine that they've nicknamed Bossy because it looks a bit like a cow. They're building this robotic machine with some really interesting tech when you think about that. This novel was written in 1955. So what we have is this machine that is almost sentient, that is extremely intelligent and makes decisions purely on facts, not pre-proposed dogmatic views, right? So it just purely acts on logic and facts. So we find that Joey, the two professors that are helping build this bossy creature, soon get into a bit of difficulties with the mass populace who are fearing this creation of theirs because a whole lot of really interesting things that I don't want to talk to spoil your reading pleasure, but they're sort of on the run. And really at the end of the day, this story is really about AI or artificial intelligence back in the days in these robotic creatures, and a whole lot of psychoanalysis as well. So the novel challenges dogmatic and deeply rooted beliefs and puts them head to head against unbiased, provable facts. And the question really is, are we better off freed from the shackles that bind us and limit our progression, or are we better off with the freedom that allows us to believe that we're right? So I found this to be an interesting novel. So what is there to like in Mark Clifton's and Frank Riley's They'd Rather Be Right? Look, this one is fascinating because several times through reading this novel, I had to remind myself that this novel is written in the 50s, right? It was actually serialized in Outstanding magazine, so it harks back to 1950s era. And I've got to say that the fears that we find in the large populace here around the use of artificial intelligence, to some degree, is still very relevant today with the abounding nature of AI and how quickly this technology is starting to already shape our world. And I found that to be rather fascinating that a novel written 70 odd years ago still has some very clever insights and a really interesting way to look at AI. And I think a very pragmatic way to look at AI in the last chapters of this novel. So I was really amazed that a novel written so long ago could still hold so many truths today. Now, the other thing that I really enjoyed is that this novel does provoke a whole lot of thinking. There is a whole section on here. Really, the book is primarily around psychoanalysis, right? And there's a lot of questions that are thrown at you. And this is one of those novels that do make you think. And I enjoyed that. I really enjoyed the thought experiment here that doesn't come without some penalties that I will talk to when I talked about some of my dislikes. But I'd have to say that for me, I actually really enjoyed that thought experiment. I really liked the questions that Mark Clifton and Frank Riley were asking, especially given that this was written in the 50s around AI and around what's holding human nature back and some controversial ways of us removing those shackles. So as a thought experiment, I'd have to give it full marks. I thought it was brilliant. It was really well done. I wouldn't say it's the most well-researched novel, but it definitely asked questions that had me interested and were thought-provoking. So I would say that this one is definitely ahead of its time. It looks at the psychoanalytical processes in a very Freudian manner that are still today very controversial, and potentially more so back in the 50s with the birth of Scientology, which I think resulted in some of the backlash that we see even today with this novel. So what is there that I didn't like? And are those claims that this is the worst of the Hugo award-winning novels justified? Well, I'd have to say this for it. The novel is written by two different authors, and sometimes it really reads exactly like that. It does read like we have some copy and paste from either Frank or Mark's work combined together and said, yeah, I really like these ideas and I'm going to just copy and paste them into here, and somehow it's all going to make sense. So I think when it comes to the execution, it wasn't really well done. I think those two authors were just a bit too different to have a really coherent novel in the storyline. But look, it was obvious definitely, but it didn't take away from my enjoyment of this one. So I'd have to say, yeah, it was disappointing as far as these two different authors writing in very different ways and different. You can see that they really had very different ideas at times that didn't quite gel or work together 100%. The other thing that I would have to say is that there are some huge, absolutely huge leaps of faith in this novel. By the sense that, you have this AI machine that is basically a psychologist, right? Can perform all this psychoanalysis and read your brain and just understand what are the inhibitions that you have. And somehow by removing those, just by giving the patient a bit of plasma, or actually a fair bit of plasma, they could rejuvenate to a point where they were, born again, right? In the sense that you have 70-year-olds who can get back into their 20s, right? So I thought there was just this huge leap of faith required of the reader to believe that this artificial intelligence, just by doing some psychoanalysis, would be able to rejuvenate you. I mean, that was really a far stretch, something that was difficult, even for a science fiction reader, I suspect, even back in 1950, to fully come to terms with. So I sort of thought that was a really big ask of the reader, and look, I enjoyed it, but I just thought it was a bit too much of a stretch of the imagination. The other thing that I would have to say for it, it does feel at times like either Frank Riley or Mark Clifton, I haven't bothered researching who held to these psychoanalytical views, but it does sound at times like they're just sitting on their soapbox and preaching. Now, I've made comments like this in the past. I do like it at times, and we see a lot of that happen with Heinlein when he gets on his soapbox and starts preaching his beliefs, right? And this is sort of in some ways very similar to that, but I'd have to say that I didn't find it as annoying as I found other times I've critiqued similar soapbox operas, right? But I'd have to say that this one didn't come across as bad, maybe because I'm not really familiar with the psychoanalytical world, and I thought some of the questions they asked were fair enough and rather interesting and thought-provoking, and for that I'd have to say I enjoyed it. So when it comes to recommendations, can I still recommend what most people would classify as the worst of the Hugo Awards? And I would have to say 100% yes. And why is that? It's because I really don't think you can say that this is the worst of the Hugo Award-winning novels if you have not read all the Hugo Award-winning novels and applied some kind of criteria to justify your claims. But I want to make this a call to you, I guess an appeal, is don't discard this novel without having read it, right? And I feel if you do read it and you didn't like it, you're 100% in your right to say, yeah, this was not my novel, and maybe if I had read all the novels, this potentially would be at the bottom of the list. But it wasn't necessarily my experience. I really enjoyed the thought-provoking exercise in this, and I would highly recommend it to all you vintage fans out there. just to see how, our grandparents in many ways, and parents back in the 50s, saw the rise of sentient computers and saw the rise of computers generally, and foresaw that maybe one day these machines that we're building could have the potential to think and do psychoanalysis on us and break our shackles. And for that, I'd have to give this book top marks for doing just that. So when it comes to similar novels that we've read or ranked on the Sci-Fi Shed Ladder today, there's nothing quite like The Forever Machine by Mark Riley and Mark Clifton and Frank Riley. But it might be worthwhile just talking to some of the novels that were released in 1954 that were eligible for the Hugo Award that year. And one of those novels was none other than Asimov's The Caves of Steel, which we have talked about several times on this channel. And this one really was a contender for the Hugo. A very wonderful novel. And between the two, it would be a really difficult choice to say which one was the more worthier Hugo novel. But when we look at some of the other novels that were released in that time frame to be eligible for the Hugos, we have novels like I Am Legend by Richard Matheson that was also a definite contender. But I'd have to say that even though that novel sort of introduced us to the zombie apocalypse in many ways, I just don't think that that one was as thought provocative as what we find in the Forever Machine. So when it comes to, getting us engaged, and I thought I'll probably have given this one the Hugo over I Am Legend. The other one that's there is Jack Finney's The Body Snatchers. Now, I thought that made an absolutely brilliant movie adaptation. But again, I'd have to say, as a novel, this one did go places that challenged the reader, and challenges the reader even today, some 70 years after. So I'd have to say I probably would have given this one the Hugo Award again when comparing it to The Body Snatchers. So really, for that 55, it would have to have been between these two wonderful novels. And I'm not going to suggest I know better than what the Hugo panel did back in 1955 to pick The Forever Machine, but I should say, have a go. I think you will enjoy these books if you've enjoyed any of the others that I've talked to so far. Now, Mark Clifton did write another book that I've read that I have reviewed on the Sci-Fi Shed, and that's When They Came from Space. Now, I thought this was a really interesting novel as well. It sort of took a satirical view on first contact, and I thought it raised some really interesting questions again, and I really thoroughly enjoyed this one. So if you've enjoyed this in the past, I'd say have a go at The Forever Machine, and I think you'll find the similarities being the same author, but this one does read more concisely, which was one of the negatives I had in The Forever Machine. So I'd say, yeah, if you've enjoyed Mark Clifton's When They Came from Space, or vice versa, I think you're going to enjoy that. When it comes to other similar novels, the inaugural Hugo Award winning novel In the Demolished Man by Alfred Bester, an absolute classic that's doing really well in the Sci-Fi Shed Ladder. But this one also talked to extrasensory perception and being able to read minds, and how do you hide a murder if the detectives can read your mind, right? So this was a classic. And again, very similar kind of novel in many ways to what we find in The Forever Machine, with Joey there being able to read minds. And I'd have to say that the two novels are similar, and it's sort of interesting what was happening in the times, right? To make this an interesting idea for readers at the time. But look, I'd say if you've enjoyed The Demolished Man, I reckon you're going to enjoy The Forever Machine as well. And vice versa. When it comes to the memory test, look, this one has some challenges when it comes to the memory test. I read this one, it must have been 22, 23 years ago, the last time I read it, between rereads. And I'd have to say, this time round, reading it, there wasn't much I could remember about the characters, to be honest. And there wasn't really much about the artificial bossy and AI thing that I could recall. And honestly, couldn't remember much about the psychoanalytical views of this novel as well. So it just about read like a brand new book to me, which was a bit disappointing because it did not pass the memory test. And I wonder if that's because this novel really isn't talked about a whole lot, and especially talked about in a positive way. So maybe that has something to do with why this one didn't quite hold up to the memory test. But I'm going to rank it. I'm going to answer my question for myself as to whether or not this is the worst of the Hugo Awards. So let me flip the board and see where this one lands tonight. Back to the Sci-Fi Shed Lad and ranking today's Hugo Award-winning novel for 1955, Mark Clifton and Frank Riley's The Forever Machine. And is this truly the worst of the Hugo Award-winning novels when I apply consistently the criteria I've documented down below? Now, I'm looking at the A side here, and we've got a wonderful novel to begin with The Demolished Man. Because they also talked about extrasensory perception, being able to read minds. But I would be hard-pressed to say that The Demolished Man, or rather The Forever Machine, is better than The Demolished Man. It just isn't. The Demolished Man was a beautiful story, excellent, reverse murder mystery, awesome police procedural novel, just a blend and a wonderfully written novel that I just can't say The Forever Machine is better than The Demolished Man. And straight on the bottom, on the A side, we got Flowers for Algernon, and I think we need to flip the board. I think there'll be no argument here that The Forever Machine would outrank Flowers for Algernon. So let me flip the board. So let's take a look at the B side, and the bottom of the trio at the moment is In the Stone Sky, The Fifth Season, and The Obelisk Gate. And is The Forever Machine better than those three novels? And I'd have to say 100% yes. There's no way to date that anyone's been able to convince me that the writing in the Stone Earth series is better, or the concept, or the characters, or the plot, or anything else when I apply my full criteria down below, that Mark Riley's and Mark Clifton's and Frank Riley's Forever Machine isn't better than what we find in the Stone Earth series. Which takes us to novels like Slow River. Now, Slow River was a well-written novel. There's no disagreement there. But the concept was pretty bland. It wasn't a great, fantastic science fiction concept or fantasy concept, nor do I think it was well executed. So I'm going to have to, again, give it to Forever Machine over Slow River. I've criticised The Falling Woman in the past because I challenged whether or not that truly held to the prerequisites for it being considered a fantasy novel. And I'll link my video down below so you can sort of see what my thoughts were. But I'd have to say that The Falling Woman didn't really quite hit the spot for me if we're going to say this was a award-winning fantasy novel. The same can be said about The Healer's War, which was just a forced fantasy theme. I just thought that was better written just as a war novel, and it would have been wonderful. But throwing magic in there, it sort of spoiled the reading experience for me. So again, I'm going to have to give it to The Forever Machine. Now we're starting to get interesting when we talk about novels like No Enemy But Time, Timescape by Gregory Benford, and the two award-winning novels by Fritz Leiber in The Wanderer and The Big Time. Because I think it's going to be somewhere here. And maybe even higher than that, because when I look at Timescape, for example, Timescape was a great concept, but it really did get bogged down in the science to the detriment of the characters and the plot and the writing and just about anything else. So I'm going to have to say again that I think Mark Clifton's and Frank Riley's novel is better than Timescape. So we're definitely not talking the bottom of the bunch, right? Now, The Wanderer and Fritz Leiber, I don't know, man. Part of me says that this novel was more enjoyable than Catherine Assaro's The Quantum Rose. And I was going to start shuffling things around because we got things like The Einstein Intersection, which was a classic, really screwed up novel, and things like Dream Snake and The Wanderer and The Big Time. My heart says that I really did enjoy The Wanderer, and I really did enjoy The Big Time. But if I'm fair to my criteria down below, I think The Forever Machine has done more. Because when I look at my full criteria, I've given it really good marks when it comes to the concepts around AI and psychoanalysis and the blending of the two and some really thought-provoking questions. So it did really well in the concepts. It sort of did okay when it comes to the execution it didn't get the top marks, but the characters were poorly rated. The writing was just mediocre, as was the plot. But I really did enjoy the ending, and it did hold to the memory test to some degree. I did remember certain aspects of this novel as I was reading through it. And I'd have to say that it was stronger, and I'm going to give it to the to Forever Machine over the Quantum Rose, because I did feel it was a bit more memorable. I think the science fiction in the Forever Machine was a little more tangible than what we found in the Quantum Rose. That was, I would say, a really good masquerade of a really deep technical science fiction theme. But the masquerading sort of diluted it to a point that it didn't really read like science fiction. Where the Forever Machine, I'm going to have to give it to it. I did enjoy the Forever Machine. I would have to say that with the Wanderer, I thought the concept in the Wanderer was stronger, but it failed in the execution pretty miserably, as did Big Time. So that's where it stands. So when it comes to me ranking this novel, it's not the bottom of the list. But it is towards the latter rung of novels when it will all be said and done. So look, I would love to hear your opinions. Have you read it? Have you read all the Hugos? Would you rank this one as the worst of the worst? I haven't, as can be seen now. I'd say it's still a very worthy award-winning novel, but as always, I would love to hear your opinions. If you agree or disagree, or if you haven't read it, if this has swayed your thoughts, are you now keen to read this one, or are you still going to say, you know what, there's so many more interesting novels to read that I'm just going to forget this one altogether? I think that would be a bit sad, because I really thought this one was great. Hey, thank you for spending time with me in the shed, and I'll see you next time. I've got some really interesting novels coming up, so I can't wait to share them with you next time in the shed.